In this showcase short, I share my 1972 copy of this, known to some as the Devil's Gallop 45, a non-LP single recorded in '68 by the Bread and Beer Band, a session group that included a pre-fame Elton John on keyboards and vocals. Learn why their album was never released, why it took 3 years to release this 1972 disc, and all about Conrad's foot. What's Conrad's foot? Well, those are the kinds of questions that we ponder here at Collecting Elton. Stay tuned. It was fall 1968. I've Been Loving You, Elton's first single, had been released earlier that year, but failed to chart. The Regimental Sergeant Zippo album was finished, but Elton's record contract was for singles, not albums. Elton and Bernie continued writing songs, but their employer, Dick James, felt reluctant to release anything that didn't sound like an instant hit, so Elton sought session work just about anywhere he could find it. Enter Tony King, record producer and emerging pop impresario who, that fall, wanted session musicians for a jam group. The concept: after spending afternoons at the pub, the group would spend evenings recording trippy instrumental cover versions of contemporary pop songs. The result was the Bread and Beer Band, a kind of supergroup comprising Caleb Quaye on guitar, Roger Pope on drums, Bernie Calvert of the Hollies on bass, and on keyboards and occasional vocals, Elton John. Joining them were Eliza Strike on backing vocals and Lennox Jackson, her husband, on percussion. Tony King co-produced alongside a young Chris Thomas, the latter one of Elton's acquaintances from the Royal Academy of Music and who, just months earlier, had worked alongside his mentor, George Martin, on some of the Beatles' White Album tracks. As both King and Thomas worked for Martin at the time, the Bread and Beer Band would be an Air Studios project and recorded at Abbey Road. For 3 weeks that November, the group reported to the famous studios regularly, rehearsing and recording experimental covers of songs like Sam the Sham's Woolly Bully, Donovan's Mellow Yellow, The Searchers' Needles and Pins, and even the Zorba the Greek movie theme. But the project was short-lived, having produced about an album's worth of tracks, but no clear plan for doing anything with them, and nothing that could be released as a single. So Tony King reassembled the group that December to record a cover of The Devil's Gallop, the theme to the old Dick Barton Special Agent radio serial, which the BBC had produced from 1946 to 51. King would release the band's cover of The Devil's Gallop as a single, and depending on the response, consider releasing the rest of the tapes as an album. In February '69, The Devil's Gallop appeared on Decca Records, Tony King's former label, but it was not a commercial release. Decca pressed only promotional copies for distribution to radio and newspapers. Curiously, the single's flip side featured what I think was one of the band's best tracks, Breakdown Blues, a 12-bar blues original co-written by the band's 4 principal members. It was the only original composition the Bread and Beer Band ever produced. But beyond a few warm notices, Devil's Gallop did not get much attention, and Decca declined going any further with the project. Not only did they not release stock copies of the Devil's Gallop single, when King played the unreleased album to them, Decca called it rubbish. The Bread and Beer Band, it seemed, was finished. But for fun, Tony King privately pressed a small batch of copies of what would have been the band's LP, self-titled and complete with a custom sleeve. And to make light of Decca's remark, King used the name Rubbish Records for the album's label, its catalog number, Trash-01. Now that might have been the end of the story, but then came Conrad's foot. Having released Elton's Empty Sky in 1969, and preparing to release Elton's self-titled album, in spring 1970, Dick James took the Bread and Beer Band tapes and released, that April, the group's second single, this time pulling tracks from the unreleased album. The band's cover of Donovan's Mellow Yellow took the A-side, and their cover of the Box Tops' The Letter served as B-side, the latter featuring prominent backing vocals from Elton. DJM also announced that, in May of that year, it would finally release the band's LP, which DJM had retitled Funky Feet. But that wasn't the only change. Both the new single and the forthcoming album would carry the band name Conrad's Foot. Few sources have ever included the Conrad's Foot 45 of 1970 in their coverage of Elton's early years. and no source I know of has ever explained what the band's second and totally bizarre name meant. Well, I found the answer in an old newspaper, one of only two I've ever seen, that covered the release of the Mellow Yellow 45. Chosen by Stephen James, Dick's son, the name Conrad's Foot referenced the Apollo 12 space mission of the previous November, specifically the moment when Commander Pete Conrad stepped from the lunar module to the moon's surface, and the words Conrad's Foot flashed across TV screens. But like a fart in space, the Mellow Yellow 45 was heard by virtually no one. Extremely few copies survive today, and obviously DJM never released Funky Feet. It's too bad because the band's album is a great listen, especially when you're already very relaxed. Oddly, after abandoning the Devil's Gallop in 1969, Decca finally released stock copies of the single in November '72, and that's the version that I have here. It's the earliest non-promo copy obtainable on the collector's market. It's also one of three versions of the 1972 re-release. There were white and blue label promo copies, not to be confused with the promos from '69. Then the early blue label stock copies that misspell Gallop in the A-side's title. And then the later blue label stock copies with Galop corrected. Why did Decca finally release the single commercially in 1972? Was it to cash in on Elton's success in the UK? Well, no source that I can find has ever explained this. One would think the record's association with Elton was the reason. In February of that year, Elton had filled London's Royal Festival Hall. In May, his new album Honky Chateau rose to #2 on the UK Albums Chart and Rocket Man to #2 on the Singles Chart. He was becoming a household name. And yet nowhere on the 1972 Devil's Gallop disc did the name Elton John appear. And of all the journalists that reviewed the single upon its re-release, not one seemed to know that it was in any way connected to Elton John. So if it wasn't the Elton connection, what was it? Well, I dug around and I found the answer. In November '72, to help celebrate the 50th anniversary of the BBC, Radio 2 revived the Dick Barton serial, producing a 2-week run of all new episodes. And according to the date printed on the 1972 promo copies, Decca re-released The Devil's Gallop on November 3rd, just days before the Dick Barton revival premiered. A coincidence? Not at all. And once more, the single went nowhere, but at least they tried. The band's LP has never received an official release, and something tells me it never will. By the mid-70s, John Reid had acquired the album's tapes, but whether Reid still has them, I don't know, and obviously he's never released anything from them. Various acetates from the sessions occasionally turn up for auction. Copies of the 1969 Private Press LP seldom come up for auction, and when they do, well, I can't afford a copy, can you? In 1994, a bootleg label called Wig released the Lost album on CD. Copies of that aren't hard to find even 30 years later, but before you hunt for one, know that these recordings are available right here on YouTube, and you'll find a link to one of them in this video's description. The sound quality isn't bad, but it isn't the best either. It was, after all, a bootleg. If you want just the non-LP single, The Devil's Gallop, or its B-side, Breakdown Blues, I have better news. An Elton-related collection called Songbook, released in the UK in 1993, included Breakdown Blues, and it sounds like a quality tape transfer. But if you can't find a copy of Songbook, don't worry. Both Breakdown Blues and Devil's Gallop have been authorized for streaming on certain platforms. And, released internationally in 2020, the Jewelbox 8-CD set also includes both tracks, and those transfers sound very, very good. Is The Devil's Gallop essential Elton? Well, not unless you really enjoy Elton's early Pre-Empty Sky material, or cheeseball novelty records more generally. The B-side, Breakdown Blues, is by far the bigger gem, and displays just how brilliant Elton's improvisational keyboard skills were, even at this early stage. It further shows the chemistry Elton had when playing with the right group of performers. I wouldn't say he had that kind of chemistry with Bluesology, but he definitely had it with the Bread and Beer Band. And again, it's a shame the album's never been released, because if it was available, it would easily pass my Essential Elton test. Musically, it is, in my opinion, one of the most enjoyable side projects Elton has ever done. As always, thanks for watching. Please click like on this video and consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already. I'm just getting started. But like a fart in space, the mellow yellow 45 was heard by virtually no one. Okay, let's do that again. Whoops. Okay.